What if I told you that for 18 years, a nightmare lived and breathed just 20 feet away from normal life? That behind a quiet suburban fence, past a garden of overgrown bushes and rusted lawn chairs, existed a secret world of unimaginable horror. That neighbors waved hello to a monster every single morning, never knowing that salvation was so close, yet impossibly far. This is the story of Phillip Garrido, a man who transformed an ordinary backyard into a prison without walls, a predator who hid his crimes in plain sight while the world remained blind. But more importantly, this is the story of survival, of a spirit that refused to break, and of a justice that came not from the powerful, but from two ordinary women who simply paid attention when no one else did. If you're watching this, you need to understand something. This story will challenge everything you believe about safety, about vigilance, about the thin line between civilization and chaos. It will make you look at your own neighborhood differently. It will make you question every fence, every quiet house, every stranger who seems just a little too normal. And by the end, you will understand why some victories take nearly 2 decades to achieve, and why they're worth every agonizing moment of waiting. Before we go any further, I need you to do something. If you believe that stories like this need to be told, if you believe that awareness can prevent future tragedies, share this video right now. Hit that subscribe button. Because the only way we stop monsters like Phillip Garrido is by shining light into the darkest corners of our world. Do it now. Someone you know needs to hear this story. Let me take you back to Antioch, California, a city that sits in the shadow of Mount Diablo, a place where the American dream was supposed to flourish. Tree-lined streets, family barbecues, the sound of children playing until the streetlights came on. In 1991, this was a community where people still believed that safety existed, that the monsters lived somewhere else, in the big cities, in the places where danger was expected. Phillip Garrido lived on Walnut Avenue, in a house that from the front looked like every other home on the block. A bit weathered, perhaps, the lawn a little overgrown, but nothing that would make you cross the street, nothing that would make you clutch your children closer. He was the quiet neighbor, the one who kept to himself but always managed to smile. He talked about God sometimes, about redemption and second chances. His wife Nancy stood beside him, a small woman with empty eyes who rarely spoke unless spoken to. What the neighbors didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that Phillip Garrido had already revealed exactly who he was. In 1976, 15 years before the event that would eventually expose his true nature, Garrido had kidnapped a woman named Katie Calloway in South Lake Tahoe. He had taken her to a warehouse in Reno, a building he had soundproofed with mattresses, a building he had prepared specifically for captivity. For hours, he had subjected her to unspeakable violence. Katie survived. She escaped. She identified her attacker. And the system, the very system designed to protect the innocent, failed catastrophically. Garrido was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison for that crime. 50 years, a lifetime meant to keep society safe from a man who had proven beyond all doubt that he was a predator. But the parole board saw something else. They saw a man who had found God, who spoke eloquently about his mistakes, who seemed genuinely reformed. After serving only 11 years, Phillip Garrido walked free. Think about that for a moment. A man who had built a soundproofed room for the specific purpose of imprisonment and torture was deemed safe enough to release. into the community. He was given a second chance, placed under parole supervision, and sent back into the world with nothing but a promise to be good. Nancy, his wife, had waited for him. She had visited him in prison, had listened to his sermons about divine purpose, had allowed herself to believe that love could transform even the darkest soul. When he came home, she was ready to follow him wherever he led, and Phillip Garrido had plans. The backyard of the Walnut Avenue house was not visible from the street. A wooden fence, tall enough to obscure everything behind it, separated the property from prying eyes. Over time, Garrido began to build. Sheds appeared, structures that looked from the outside like ordinary storage spaces. Tarps covered areas of the yard, creating pockets of shadow even in the California sunshine. He explained to neighbors that he was a pack rat, that he collected things, that the backyard was his private project space. No one questioned it. Why would they? People have hobbies. People have eccentricities. In a world where we value privacy, where we believe that a man's home is his castle, who were they to judge? But behind that fence, Phillip Garrido was constructing something far more sinister than a storage area. He was building a prison, a compound of tents and soundproofed sheds, a maze of structures hidden beneath trees and camouflage, a place where someone could disappear completely, where screams would go unheard, where years could pass in invisible agony. The monster had learned from his first crime. The warehouse in Reno had been discovered. The victim had escaped. This time, Garrido would be smarter. This time, the prison would be in his own backyard, under his constant control. This time, no one would ever find out. And so in the summer of 1991, as the world outside continued its ordinary rhythms, Phillip Garrido prepared to create a nightmare that would last nearly 2 decades. He watched. He waited. He planned. And somewhere in the distance, a young girl named Jaycee Dugard had no idea that her entire life was about to be stolen by a man who believed God had given him the right to take whatever he wanted. The countdown to tragedy had begun. Chapter 2. The Vanishing. June 10th, 1991, a Monday morning in South Lake Tahoe, California. The sun was already warming the mountain air, burning off the last wisps of fog from the previous night. It was the kind of morning that promised summer, that smelled of pine trees and possibility, that made children eager for the freedom of vacation just weeks away. Jaycee Lee Dugard was 11 years old. She had blonde hair, a shy smile, and the kind of quiet determination that her mother, Terry, had always admired. That morning, Jaycee got dressed for school like she had done 1,000 times before. She ate breakfast. She gathered her backpack. She walked out the front door of her home and began the short journey to the bus stop at the end of her street. Terry Probin watched from the window. She always watched. That moment when her daughter disappeared around the corner. That brief interval between the safety of home and the safety of school. In that window, in those few hundred yards, existed a vulnerability that every parent knows, but rarely acknowledges. We tell ourselves that nothing will happen. We tell ourselves that the world is basically safe. We tell ourselves that vigilance is paranoia, that we cannot wrap our children in cotton and expect them to grow. Terry saw Jaycee turn the corner. Then she turned away from the window to continue her morning routine. She would never forgive herself for that moment. For years, she would replay it in her mind, wondering if she had stayed at the window just 30 seconds longer, Would she have seen the gray sedan? Would she have seen the strange woman behind the wheel? Would she have run, screaming down the street in time to save her daughter? But she didn't stay, and the world kept spinning, indifferent to the horror that was about to unfold. Jaycee walked toward the bus stop, her mind probably occupied with the ordinary concerns of an 11-year-old. Homework, friends, the slow arrival of summer. She didn't notice the car approaching from behind, a gray Ford sedan moving slowly, almost cautiously. Inside, Phillip Garrido sat in the passenger seat, his body tense with anticipation. His wife Nancy gripped the steering wheel, her face expressionless, following instructions she had been given dozens of times. They had been watching this route for weeks. They knew exactly when the bus came. They knew exactly where the houses had the worst sight lines. They had rehearsed this moment until it felt as natural as breathing. The car pulled alongside Jaycee. The passenger door opened, and in a motion so quick that no witness could have processed what they were seeing, Phillip Garrido reached out and grabbed the girl. He pulled her into the vehicle. She barely had time to scream before a taser sent 50,000 volts through her small body and consciousness fled. The car drove away. The street returned to silence, and just like that, Jaycee Lee Dugard vanished from the face of the earth. Jaycee's stepfather Carl saw something. From a distance, he had noticed a car, had seen what looked like some kind of commotion near a girl who might have been Jaycee. His mind, unable to process the impossible, initially dismissed what he was seeing. But as the seconds ticked by, as the car disappeared and no girl remained on the sidewalk, a terrible understanding began to dawn. He ran. He ran toward the bus stop, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He searched the area, calling Jaycee's name, his voice growing more desperate with each passing moment. The bus stop was empty. The street was empty. His stepdaughter had been there, and now she was gone. The police were called within minutes. Officers arrived at the scene expecting to find a lost child. A misunderstanding. Perhaps a young girl who had simply walked to a friend's house without telling anyone. What they found instead was the beginning of a nightmare. Witnesses remembered seeing a gray sedan. No one had gotten a license plate. No one could describe the occupants with any useful detail. It was as if the earth had simply opened and swallowed an 11-year-old girl whole. The investigation began with hope. Amber alerts, search parties, media coverage that spread Jaycee's face across the nation. Terry Probin appeared on television, her eyes hollow with grief, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The community rallied. Volunteers searched the forests around South Lake Tahoe. Tips flooded into police hotlines. Psychics offered their services. Everyone believed that Jaycee would be found. Days passed. Then weeks. Then months. The searches grew smaller. The media moved on to other tragedies. The tips became fewer and more desperate, each one offering hope that turned to ash upon investigation. The case grew cold, not because anyone stopped caring, but because there was simply nothing left to pursue. Terry never stopped looking. She created a foundation in her daughter's name. She maintained a website with Jaycee's photo, aged progression showing what the girl might look like as she grew older. She gave interviews whenever a reporter would listen, keeping her daughter's memory alive in a world that had largely moved on. Every night she went to bed wondering where Jaycee was, whether she was still alive, whether she was suffering. What Terry couldn't have known, what no one could have known, was that her daughter was alive. Not just alive, but less than 200 miles away, in the backyard of a registered sex offender, in a compound of sheds and tents that had been specifically designed to be invisible. The prison that Phillip Garrido had constructed was unlike anything investigators had ever imagined. Behind the fence on Walnut Avenue, hidden beneath trees and tarps and years of accumulated junk, existed a secret world. There were tents where Jaycee slept. There was a soundproofed shed where no cry for help could escape. There was no running water, no electricity, no connection to the outside world except through the man who controlled every aspect of her existence. In those first days and weeks, Jaycee was subjected to horrors that no child should ever experience. Garrido, emboldened by his success, by the absence of any consequence, became bolder in his depravity. He spoke to Jaycee about God, about destiny, about how she had been chosen for a special purpose. He mixed religion with abuse, creating a twisted theology where his crimes were transformed into divine will. And Jaycee, an 11-year-old girl, ripped from everything she knew and loved, began the impossible task of survival. She learned to read Garrido's moods. She learned when to speak and when to stay silent. She learned to retreat into herself, to find places in her mind where the horror couldn't reach. She learned in ways that no child should ever have to learn, how to stay alive. The world above continued its ordinary rhythms. Neighbors mowed their lawns, mail was delivered, holidays came and went. And behind the fence on Walnut Avenue, 18 years of captivity began. Chapter 3, The Invisible Prison. How does a person survive the unsurvivable? How does a child, ripped from everything she knows and loves, maintain her humanity in conditions designed to destroy it? These are questions that have no easy answers, questions that Jaycee Dugard would spend nearly 2 decades answering with nothing but her own remarkable strength. The backyard compound where Jaycee was held was a masterpiece of concealment. Phillip Garrido had spent years constructing it, and he continued to improve it throughout her captivity. From the street, from the houses next door, from the occasional parole officer who visited the property, nothing appeared amiss. The front yard was unkempt but not alarming. The house itself, though cluttered, gave no indication of the horrors occurring just a few dozen feet away. But behind the fence, reality twisted into something unrecognizable. The compound consisted of multiple structures, tents, and sheds arranged in a maze-like configuration that would have been almost impossible for an outsider to navigate. Trees grew tall and thick, their branches creating a canopy that blocked the view from above. Tarps and plastic sheets covered the spaces between structures, creating a continuous barrier against observation. Jaycee's living space was primitive beyond comprehension. In those early years, she slept in a tent, on a mattress that sat directly on the ground. There was no bathroom, no kitchen, no privacy of any kind. Phillip Garrido controlled when she ate, when she slept, when she was allowed to see the sky. He controlled her reality so completely that the outside world began to seem like a fading dream. The psychological torture was perhaps even more devastating than the physical. Garrido told Jaycee that her family had stopped looking for her. He told her that they had moved on, that they had forgotten about her, that no one would believe her if she somehow managed to escape. He showed her news reports where other missing children cases were eventually closed, using them as proof that hope was futile. He created a world where he was her only connection to anything, where his approval was the only form of comfort available, and yet Jaycee did not break. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of her story, the part that speaks to something profound about human resilience. In conditions designed to destroy her spirit, she found ways to survive. She created rituals, small acts of defiance that reminded her she was still a person. She watched birds through gaps in the tarps and imagined they were carrying messages to her mother. She dreamed of rescue, not constantly, not obsessively, but enough to keep a small flame of hope alive. Time moved differently in the compound. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Jaycee grew from a child into a teenager, and then into a young woman, all within walls that never changed. The world outside continued its revolutions, technology advanced, fashion shifted, but behind the fence on Walnut Avenue, time stood still. In 1994, 3 years into her captivity, Jaycee became pregnant. She was 14 years old. The father was Phillip Garrido, and the pregnancy was the result of repeated assault that had become so normalized within the compound that it barely registered as the atrocity it was. 9 months later, in August of 1994, Jaycee gave birth to a baby girl. She named her daughter Starlet. The birth occurred in the backyard compound, without medical assistance, without pain relief, without any of the support that new mothers typically receive. Nancy Garrido, Philip's wife, was present, following instructions like she always did. Jaycee, at 14, became a mother in conditions that would have been considered inhumane for livestock. But something shifted in Jaycee with that birth. The child gave her purpose. It gave her someone to protect, someone to love, someone whose future might somehow be better than the present. Jaycee began to focus her energy not just on her own survival, but on raising her daughter in circumstances that made normal parenting impossible. 2 years later, in 1997, Jaycee gave birth again. Another girl whom she named Angel. Now there were 3 captives behind the fence, a mother and 2 daughters living in a world that shouldn't have existed. Here's something I want you to think about. Jaycee Dugard was raising 2 children in a backyard prison, and she was determined to give them as normal a childhood as possible. She taught them to read, she played games with them, she told them stories and sang them songs. In the midst of unimaginable horror, she created pockets of normalcy, moments of love and connection that defied everything Phillip Garrido was trying to achieve. What does that say about the human spirit? What does it say about a mother's love? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Leave a comment below and tell me what this makes you feel. Sometimes, processing these stories together is the only way to make sense of them. The Garrido household developed its own twisted ecosystem. Phillip continued his delusions of divine mission, spending hours writing manifestos about his special connection to God, about his ability to control sound with his mind, about the great work he was destined to accomplish. He started a printing business which gave him a veneer of respectability and an excuse for the various structures on his property. Nancy, his wife, remained an enigma. She had been with Phillip since before his first kidnapping, had stayed with him through his imprisonment, had participated willingly in the abduction of an 11-year-old child. Some would later argue that she too was a victim, that years of psychological manipulation had destroyed her ability to resist. Others would point out that she had multiple opportunities to seek help, to contact authorities, to do literally anything to stop the suffering of an innocent child. The truth, as always, existed somewhere in the complexity of human weakness. Parole officers visited the property regularly. Phillip Garrido was, after all, a registered sex offender with a prior conviction for kidnapping. He was supposed to be under supervision, supposed to be monitored, supposed to be prevented from committing exactly the type of crime he was currently committing. But the visits were superficial. Officers checked in at the house, conducted brief conversations, noted that Garrido seemed to be complying with his conditions. They never looked behind the fence. They never explored the backyard compound. They never discovered the 3 human beings living in conditions that violated every standard of decency. This failure of the system would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. How had parole officers missed such an obvious violation? How had a registered sex offender been allowed to construct a prison in his backyard without anyone noticing? The answers were uncomfortable. Budget constraints meant that officers were overworked and undertrained. Procedures prioritized paperwork over thorough investigation. And perhaps most damning, the assumption that sex offenders could be reformed led to a complacency that cost Jaycee 18 years of her life. As the years passed, the compound grew more elaborate. Garrido added structures, improved the concealment, created separate living spaces for his captives. The girls, Starlet and Angel, grew up knowing no other life. To them, the backyard compound was normal. The strange man who controlled their world was simply part of existence. They had never been to school, never had friends their own age, never experienced the basic freedoms that most children take for granted. Jaycee walked an impossible tightrope. She had to maintain enough compliance to keep herself and her daughter safe, while also preserving some sense of self that Garrido couldn't touch. She found solace in small things, in watching her daughters play, in the changing of seasons that she could observe through gaps in the tarps, in the stubborn persistence of hope that refused to die completely. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she remembered. She remembered her mother's face. She remembered her home in South Lake Tahoe. She remembered a life before the fence, before the compound, before Phillip Garrido had decided that she was his to take. Those memories, faded but never forgotten, formed the foundation of her survival. The years continued to pass. The world outside changed in ways that Jaycee could barely imagine. But behind the fence on Walnut Avenue, a family waited, invisible but alive, for a miracle that seemed less likely with each passing day. Chapter 4. The Failures of Systems. Let me tell you about the opportunities that were missed. Let me tell you about the moments when Jaycee Dugard could have been saved. When a different decision, a more thorough investigation, a single act of vigilance could have ended her nightmare years before it actually ended. Because the tragedy of this story isn't just what Phillip Garrido did. It's what the system failed to prevent. In 1988, 3 years before Jaycee was kidnapped, Phillip Garrido violated the terms of his parole. The violation was documented, the paperwork was filed, and nothing happened. He was given a warning, told to be more careful, sent back to his life without consequence. Had the system treated that violation seriously? Had Garrido been returned to prison where he belonged? Jaycee Dugard would have grown up in South Lake Tahoe, would have graduated high school, would have had a normal life. Instead, the system's leniency became his opportunity. Between 1991 and 2009, parole officers visited Phillip Garrido's residence approximately 60 times. 60 visits over 18 years. 60 opportunities to discover the truth. 60 chances to look behind the fence, to explore the backyard, to find 3 human beings living in conditions that defied belief. But the visits followed a predictable pattern. Officers would arrive at the front door. Garrido would meet them, charming and cooperative. They would have a brief conversation about his progress, his employment, his compliance with conditions. The paperwork would be completed. The officers would leave, and the captives would remain undiscovered. The backyard compound was visible from multiple angles. Neighbors could see the accumulated junk, the strange structures, the tents and tarps that covered portions of the property. But what they saw was interpreted through the lens of eccentricity rather than criminality. Garrido was the weird neighbor with the messy yard, the guy who talked too much about God, the harmless oddball that every neighborhood seems to have. Nobody called the police about conditions in the backyard. Nobody investigated too closely. The social contract that says we mind our own business protected Garrido as surely as any physical barrier. In 2006, a neighbor did call authorities to report unusual activity on the Garrido property. The caller mentioned tents in the backyard, mentioned seeing children who didn't seem to attend school, mentioned concerns that something wasn't right. A deputy was dispatched to investigate. The deputy spoke with Garrido at the front gate. Garrido explained that the tents were for storage, that there were no children on the property, that everything was perfectly normal. The deputy left. No follow-up investigation was conducted. No search of the property was attempted. 3 years of captivity could have ended that day, and instead they continued. How many times can a system fail before we acknowledge that the system itself is broken? How many chances can be missed before we understand that vigilance requires more than paperwork and protocol? These questions hung over the Garrido case like a shadow. Questions that would haunt investigators and policymakers for years to come. Meanwhile, behind the fence, life continued in its strange rhythm. Starlet and Angel grew older, educated by their mother in a curriculum assembled from whatever materials Garrido provided. Jaycee tried to give them some understanding of the outside world, some preparation for a future that might eventually arrive. She told them about school, about friendship, about all the things they had never experienced. She held on to hope that someday, somehow, they would have a chance at normal life. The girls knew nothing else. The compound was their entire universe, and Phillip Garrido's twisted ideology was the only framework they had for understanding existence. He told them stories about his special relationship with God, about the important work he was doing, about how they were all part of a divine plan that would eventually be revealed. The girls, having no competing narrative, accepted these explanations with the trust that children give to adults who control their world. But Jaycee was different. She had memories of before. She knew that the life they were living was wrong, that the world outside the fence was nothing like Garrido described, that someday the truth would emerge. She walked the impossible line between compliance and resistance, keeping her children safe while preserving some kernel of defiance that Garrido could never touch. The printing business that Garrido operated provided some contact with the outside world. Customers would occasionally visit the property, picking up orders or discussing projects. Jaycee was sometimes allowed to interact with these visitors, though always under Garrido's watchful eye. She was introduced as a family member, as a relative who helped with the business. The customers saw a quiet young woman who seemed shy but otherwise normal. None of them suspected the truth. Why didn't she ask for help? Why didn't she slip a note to a customer? Make a phone call when Garrido wasn't watching? Find some way to alert the outside world? These questions were asked frequently after her rescue, often with an undercurrent of judgment that survivors of long-term captivity frequently face. The answer is complicated. After years of psychological manipulation, Jaycee's understanding of possibility had been fundamentally altered. She had been told repeatedly that escape was impossible, that no one would believe her, that any attempt to seek help would result in punishment for herself and her daughters. She had seen Garrido's violence, had experienced the consequences of disobedience. More importantly, she had adapted to survival in conditions that required constant vigilance and complete submission. The skills that kept her alive were not compatible with the bold risk-taking that escape would require. And there were her daughters to consider. Any failed attempt at escape would put Starlet and Angel at risk. And the calculus of survival changes when you're responsible for children who depend on you completely. Jaycee made choices that prioritized their safety, even when those choices extended her own captivity. The years accumulated. 2000 became 2005, which became 2008. Technology advanced outside the fence. The internet transformed communication. Social media emerged and began to reshape human interaction. Terry Probyn continued to maintain the website for her missing daughter, continued to give interviews, continued to hope. The age progressions showed a woman now, no longer the child who had been taken from that bus stop so many years before. Police kept the case technically open, though there had been no significant developments in years. Behind the fence, Jaycee watched her daughters become teenagers. They had grown up in captivity, their entire adolescence unfolding in conditions that would have been unthinkable to the outside world. Yet somehow they had survived. Somehow they had retained their humanity. Jaycee had given them what she could, which turned out to be more than anyone would have expected possible. The miracle that would finally end their nightmare was approaching. It would come not from the parole system that had failed so completely, not from the police investigation that had gone cold, but from an unexpected source. Two ordinary women doing their jobs would pay attention at the moment when attention was needed most. The end of 18 years of captivity began with a simple observation, a raised eyebrow, a question that demanded an answer. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. The compound still held its secrets. The fence still concealed its prisoners, and the world continued to spin, oblivious to the nightmare hiding in plain sight. Chapter 5. The Plot Twist. Discovery from within August 2009. 18 years after an 11-year-old girl had been pulled into a gray sedan on a quiet street in South Lake Tahoe. 18 years of birthdays marked behind a fence, of holidays that brought no celebration, of seasons changing outside a compound that remained frozen in time. 18 years. And then in a single afternoon, everything changed. The catalyst for that change came from an unlikely source, not a police investigation, not a parole check, not a neighbor who finally decided to look too closely. The catalyst was Phillip Garrido's own delusion. Garrido had spent years developing what he believed was a revolutionary religious philosophy. He had written extensively about his supposed ability to communicate with God, about his mission to spread a message of divine truth. He had created an organization he called God's Desire and had begun to seek a public platform for his ideas. The man who had hidden 3 women in his backyard for nearly 2 decades now wanted the world to pay attention to his theology. In August 2009, Garrido requested permission to hold an event on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. He wanted to distribute his religious literature, to speak publicly about his beliefs, to recruit followers for his cause. He brought Jaycee and her 2 daughters with him to the campus, introducing them as his family members who assisted with his ministry. Campus police officer Allison Jacobs noticed the group. Something about them didn't sit right. The 2 teenage girls seemed oddly subdued, their behavior suggesting isolation rather than normal adolescent socialization. Garrido's manner was strange, his explanations of his religious mission veering into territory that seemed disconnected from reality. Jacobs began asking questions. Lisa Campbell, a special events manager at Berkeley, was also present. She observed the same things Jacobs had noticed. The girls seemed uncomfortable in social situations in a way that went beyond shyness. The woman with them, introduced as their mother, had an alertness that suggested vigilance rather than normal parental attention. Something was wrong. Campbell couldn't articulate exactly what, but her instincts were screaming. The 2 women made a decision that would alter the course of 3 lives. They told Garrido that his request for an event needed to be processed through proper channels. They needed more information about his organization, about the people accompanying him, about his background. They took down his information. And then after Garrido left the campus with his captives, they did something that hadn't been done in 18 years of parole visits and neighbor complaints. They checked. A simple database search revealed that Phillip Garrido was a registered sex offender with a kidnapping conviction. A call to his parole officer revealed that he was not supposed to have contact with minors. The presence of 2 teenage girls at the Berkeley campus, girls who had no paper trail, no school records, no documentation of any kind, suddenly became a matter of urgent concern. Garrido's parole officer was notified. And this time, unlike the dozens of times before, the notification prompted action. On August 26, 2009, Garrido was called in for a meeting at the parole office in Concord, California. He was told to bring the 2 girls and the woman who had accompanied him to Berkeley. He complied. Perhaps he believed that his divine protection would continue to shield him. Perhaps he thought that his charm could explain away any suspicions. Perhaps after 18 years of successful concealment, he had simply become incapable of imagining that his world could collapse. In the parole office, investigators began questioning the group separately. The teenage girls, Starlet and Angel, had been coached by Garrido about what to say. They gave their rehearsed answers, explaining that they were homeschooled, that their family kept to themselves, that everything was normal and fine. But the investigators were trained to detect deception. Something in the girls' responses, in their manner, in the way they glanced toward Garrido for approval, suggested that the truth was more complicated. Then investigators turned to the woman. She was quiet, clearly nervous, her eyes darting between the investigators and Garrido. They asked her name. She hesitated, they asked again. And in that moment, after 18 years of captivity, 18 years of submission, 18 years of survival through compliance, something shifted. She said her name was Alyssa. The investigators pressed. They separated her from Garrido, took her to a different room, asked questions away from the man who had controlled her world for nearly 2 decades, and slowly, carefully, with the terror of someone stepping onto uncertain ground, she began to tell the truth. Her name wasn't Alyssa. Her name was Jaycee Lee Dugard. She had been kidnapped in 1991 from South Lake Tahoe. The 2 teenage girls were her daughters, born in captivity. For 18 years, she had been held prisoner in the backyard of Phillip Garrido's home, just 20 feet from ordinary life, invisible but alive. The investigators were stunned. They had expected complications, perhaps a parole violation, maybe some questionable living situation. They had not expected to solve one of California's most notorious missing persons cases. They had not expected to find a woman who had been declared presumed dead by a legal system that had run out of hope. The news spread quickly. Within hours, law enforcement descended on Walnut Avenue in Antioch. The fence that had hidden so many secrets was finally breached. Investigators entered the backyard compound and found exactly what Jaycee had described. A maze of tents and sheds, living spaces that lacked basic amenities, evidence of 18 years of captivity, hidden in plain sight in a suburban neighborhood. Phillip and Nancy Garrido were arrested without incident. The man who had believed himself protected by divine favor was led away in handcuffs, his delusions of grandeur collapsing into the reality of criminal charges. Nancy, complicit in every aspect of the crime, followed her husband into custody, and Terry Probin received a phone call that she had dreamed of receiving for 18 years. Her daughter was alive. Her daughter was coming home. The nightmare that had begun on a June morning in 1991 was finally incredibly over. The reunion took place the following day. Terry flew to a location where Jaycee and her daughters were being held for debriefing. When she walked through the door and saw her daughter for the first time in 18 years, the decades collapsed into nothing. The child who'd been taken was now a woman. The woman had daughters of her own. But through it all, the connection remained. Mother and daughter embraced, and the world outside that room ceased to exist. Jaycee's first words to her mother were simple: "I missed you." Terry's response was simpler still: "I missed you too." The discovery made international headlines. Media outlets around the world covered the story of the woman who had survived 18 years of captivity, who had raised 2 daughters in conditions that defied imagination, who had somehow maintained her humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. The backyard compound became a symbol of both horror and hope, a reminder that the most terrible acts can coexist with the most remarkable resilience. But the work of recovery was just beginning. Jaycee had spent more time in captivity than she had spent free. Her daughters had never known any other life. The psychological damage inflicted over nearly 2 decades could not be undone with a single reunion. The journey back to normal life would be long, complicated, and unlike anything any of them had experienced. Yet they would make that journey, together, as a family finally reunited, finally free, finally beginning the impossible task of building a new life from the ashes of the old. Chapter 6: The Reckoning. Justice moved quickly once the truth was revealed. Phillip Garrido was charged with 29 felony counts, including kidnapping, rape, and false imprisonment. Jaycee Garrido faced similar charges. Her participation in every aspect of the crime, documented through evidence collected from the compound and testimony from the survivors. The legal proceedings that followed would hold both perpetrators accountable for 18 years of atrocity. The case against the Garridos was overwhelming. Physical evidence from the compound corroborated Jaycee's account in every detail. DNA testing confirmed that Phillip Garrido was the father of both Starlet and Angel. Records of parole visits documented the systemic failures that had allowed the captivity to continue for so long. There was no defense available, no explanation that could justify or mitigate what had been done. In April 2011, Phillip Garrido pleaded guilty to all charges against him. Standing before the court, the man who had claimed divine guidance for his actions offered no supernatural justification. He was sentenced to 431 years in state prison, a term calculated to ensure that he would never again walk free. The judge made clear that the sentence reflected not only the severity of the crimes, but the prolonged nature of the suffering Garrido had inflicted. Jaycee Garrido pleaded guilty to the same charges. She was sentenced to 36 years to life, a term that acknowledged her complicity while recognizing the complex dynamics that had shaped her participation. The woman who had helped abduct an 11-year-old child and had participated in 18 years of captivity would spend the remainder of her life in prison. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for the survivors to speak. Jaycee, showing remarkable composure, addressed the court through a statement read by her attorney. She spoke of the years taken from her, of the childhood lost, of the damage inflicted on her daughters who had known no other life. But she also spoke of survival, of the strength that had sustained her, of the future she was determined to build. Her words carried weight beyond the courtroom. Survivors of long-term captivity often face skepticism about their experiences, questions about why they didn't escape, judgments about their compliance. Jaycee's statement addressed these questions directly, explaining the psychological manipulation that had made resistance seem impossible, the constant threat that had made compliance the only viable survival strategy. Her testimony became a resource for understanding how such captivities operate, how perpetrators maintain control, how survivors find ways to endure. The systemic failures that had allowed Garrido's crimes to continue became the subject of intense scrutiny. Internal investigations revealed that parole officers had visited the property dozens of times without detecting the captivity. The 2006 complaint from a neighbor had been dismissed without adequate investigation. Basic protocols for monitoring sex offenders had been inadequate to prevent exactly the type of crime they were designed to prevent. The state of California conducted a comprehensive review of its parole supervision procedures. New requirements were implemented for more thorough property inspections, for better training of parole officers, for increased scrutiny of offenders with prior kidnapping convictions. The failures in the Garrido case became a catalyst for systemic reform, though the recognition that these reforms came too late for Jaycee and her daughters remained a painful reality. Jaycee herself became an advocate for change. She established the Jaycee Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting families recovering from abduction and trauma. The foundation provides resources for reunited families, funds research into the psychological effects of captivity, and works to improve support systems for survivors. Through this work, Jaycee transformed her tragedy into purpose, using her experience to help others navigate circumstances she understood all too well. Her memoir, published in 2011, provided an unprecedented window into the experience of long-term captivity. Written in her own words, the book documented the daily realities of survival, the small acts of resistance that preserved her humanity, the love she had for her daughters that gave her strength to continue. The book became a bestseller, read by millions who sought to understand how such things could happen and how a survivor could emerge with her spirit intact. But Jaycee's recovery was not a linear process. The psychological effects of 18 years of captivity could not be resolved through willpower alone. She worked with therapists who specialized in trauma, who helped her process experiences that defied normal frameworks of understanding. She learned to navigate a world that had changed dramatically during her captivity, a world of smartphones and social media that would have been unrecognizable in 1991. Her daughters faced their own challenges. Starlet and Angel had never attended school, never had friends their own age, never experienced the basic social interactions that most children take for granted. They had to learn how to be teenagers in a world they had never known, had to build identities separate from the captivity that had defined their existence. The process was difficult, marked by setbacks and struggles, but also by remarkable progress. The family found their way together. Terry Probin, who had spent 18 years refusing to give up hope, became a constant presence in her daughter's recovery. The bond between mother and daughter, stretched but never broken by nearly 2 decades of separation, proved strong enough to support the work of healing. The grandchildren she had never known became part of her life, another unexpected gift from an impossible situation. Years passed. The initial media frenzy faded into occasional updates, anniversary articles that checked in on the family's progress. Jaycee gradually stepped back from public attention, focusing on her foundation work and her family's ongoing recovery. The extraordinary circumstances of her captivity gave way to the ordinary business of living, of raising daughters, of building a future that had once seemed impossible. The backyard compound on Walnut Avenue was demolished. The structures that had concealed 18 years of captivity were torn down, the evidence cataloged and preserved, the property cleared of its dark history. A house remained, but the prison that had hidden behind it was gone, returned to ordinary suburban land that gave no indication of the horrors it had once concealed. Chapter 7. The Attempt and the Vigilance. But the Garrido case was not simply a closed chapter. The investigation revealed that Phillip Garrido had continued to harbor predatory intentions throughout Jaycee's captivity. Evidence recovered from the compound, including writings and documents, suggested that Garrido had considered targeting additional victims. The one successful kidnapping had been, in his mind, merely the beginning of a pattern he intended to repeat. Investigators found evidence of attempted approaches, of Garrido surveilling potential targets, of plans that had been developed but never executed. The same divine mission that he believed justified Jaycee's captivity extended, in his warped theology, to other young women who might be chosen for his purposes. Only the eventual discovery of his crimes prevented additional victims from suffering Jaycee's fate. This revelation added another dimension to the case's aftermath. The question was no longer simply what had happened to Jaycee Dugard, but what might have happened to others had the discovery come later or not at all. The systemic failures that had allowed 18 years of captivity were not merely tragic in retrospect. They had actively enabled a predator to plan future crimes with impunity. The recognition prompted further reforms. Monitoring procedures for high-risk offenders were strengthened. Communication between law enforcement agencies was improved. The case became a standard reference in training programs for parole officers, probation workers, and child welfare professionals. The failures that had allowed Garrido to operate were analyzed, categorized, and used to prevent similar failures in the future. But the most powerful reform came not from policy changes, but from changed awareness. The Garrido case demonstrated that monsters don't always look monstrous. They live in ordinary houses on ordinary streets. They wave to neighbors and attend community events. They hide their crimes behind fences and explanations that seem plausible until they're examined closely. And the case reminded the public that vigilance is not paranoia, that paying attention to things that don't seem quite right is a civic duty, not an intrusion. The two women who had triggered the investigation, Allison Jacobs and Lisa Campbell, became examples of what vigilance could accomplish. They had no special training in identifying captivity situations. They had no mandate to investigate Phillip Garrido's background. They simply noticed that something was wrong, trusted their instincts, and took the simple step of checking. Their actions, so unremarkable in isolation, proved to be the key that unlocked 18 years of horror. In the years following the case, their example was cited in countless training sessions and public awareness campaigns. The message was clear. If something doesn't seem right, ask questions. If questions reveal concerns, report them. The system can fail as it failed Jaycee for 18 years, but individuals paying attention can succeed where systems fail. Jaycee herself embraced this message. Through her foundation work, she emphasized the importance of awareness, of trusting instincts, of not assuming that because something seems impossible, it therefore cannot be happening. She spoke to audiences about the responsibility that communities have to protect their most vulnerable members, about the power that ordinary people have to make extraordinary differences. The attempted repeat crimes that investigators uncovered in their review of Garrido's materials never resulted in additional charges. The evidence was concerning but not conclusive enough for prosecution on crimes that had not been completed. But the knowledge that Garrido had been planning to expand his predation informed the severity of his sentence and the conditions of his imprisonment. In the end, the prevention of future crimes became another form of victory. The investigation that freed Jaycee also stopped whatever Garrido had been planning. The awareness that followed the case undoubtedly prevented other potential captivities. Other children who might have been taken had the public remained as complacent as it had been before. The tragedy of 18 lost years was counterbalanced in some small way by the future tragedies that were prevented. Chapter 8. The Light Beyond the Fence. I started this story with a question. What if a nightmare lived just 20 feet from normal life? What if monsters hid behind ordinary fences, concealed by our assumptions about what evil looks like? Now let me end with an answer. Sometimes they do, but sometimes survivors emerge from those nightmares with a strength that defies understanding, a resilience that transforms tragedy into purpose, a determination that refuses to let the darkness have the final word. Jaycee Dugard survived 18 years of captivity. She raised 2 daughters in conditions that should have destroyed all of them. She maintained her humanity, her hope, and her connection to a mother she hadn't seen since childhood. When freedom finally came, she didn't retreat from the world that had failed her. She engaged with it, using her experience to help others, to reform systems, to ensure that what happened to her would be less likely to happen to anyone else. Her daughters grew up, Starlet and Angel, who'd known nothing but the compound for their entire childhoods, learned to navigate a world they had never experienced. They attended school. They made friends. They discovered the ordinary joys and challenges that had been denied them during their captive years. The resilience their mother had modeled served them well as they built lives that their captor had never intended them to have. Terry Probin got her daughter back. The phone calls she had hoped for, the reunion she had dreamed of, the grandchildren she had never expected to know, all became real. The 18 years of waiting, of hoping, of refusing to give up, were vindicated not just by survival, but by flourishing, by a family rebuilt from fragments into something whole. Phillip Garrido will die in prison. The divine mission he believed in proved to be nothing but the delusion of a predator. The power he had wielded over 3 lives was stripped away in a single afternoon by 2 women who simply paid attention. The structures he built to conceal his crimes were torn down, returned to dust, forgotten by a world that has better things to remember. This is what justice looks like, not just punishment, though punishment matters, not just prevention, though prevention matters more. Justice looks like a survivor becoming an advocate. Justice looks like a mother reunited with her child. Justice looks like 2 girls growing up free. Justice looks like a story that ends not with despair, but with determination. Not with victimhood, but with victory. The backyard that once held a prison now holds nothing. The fence that concealed 18 years of horror has been removed. Sunlight falls on ordinary ground, and children play in neighboring yards without any knowledge of what once lurked so close. The nightmare ended, and life continued, because that is what life does when given the chance. If you've stayed with me through this story, you understand something important. You understand that evil exists, but so does resilience. You understand that systems can fail, but individuals can succeed. You understand that survival is possible, even when it seems impossible. That hope is reasonable even when despair would be easier. That the human spirit possesses strength that circumstances cannot destroy. Jaycee Dugard emerged from the darkness. Her daughters emerged with her. Her mother welcomed them home. And together, they built a future that Phillip Garrido never imagined and could never have prevented. Behind every fence in every neighborhood, there may be secrets we cannot see. But there are also witnesses who can choose to look closer, to ask questions, to trust their instincts when something doesn't seem right. Jaycee's rescue came not from sophisticated investigation, but from simple attention. The end of 18 years of captivity began with 2 women who noticed something wrong and refused to ignore it. That could be any of us. That should be all of us. The monsters hide behind fences, but they cannot hide from a community that chooses to pay attention. That is the final lesson of this story. That is the light that shines beyond the fence. Jaycee is free. Her daughters are free. Her story, once one of horror, has become one of hope. And in the end, that is the only victory that truly matters. If this story moved you, if it changed the way you think about vigilance and survival, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel because stories like this deserve to be told and retold until their lessons become part of how we live. The monsters exist, but so do the heroes. The question is, which one you choose to be.